Hello students, this is the continuation of our discussion of the Stuart Cycle of Poems by Gary Jackson from the book Missing You Metropolis. As a quick reminder, the first video covers the introduction of Stuart as a character in the book. Stuart is a figure from author Gary Jackson's past, but we need to remember that the narrators that speak about Stuart are the Jackson narrator. Let's continue our analysis by looking at the poem Machine. This poem represents the last personal interaction between Jackson and Stuart in the book. We will see another interaction in the poem Fade, but that is a different type of interaction. The closeness between Stuart and Jackson in this poem begins to dissipate and separate. If you remember from the first poem, Stuart, that poem describes how the Jackson narrator and Stuart were amazingly close friends, as close as any superhero combo like Batman and Robin and Captain America and Bucky. Machine represents the moment when the dynamic duo of Stuart and the Jackson narrator begin to fall apart. In comics, the heroic duos don't ever break up. There will always be a Batman and a Robin. Even as if in the comics Robin were to die, he will always be brought back to life via some magical or comic book wackiness. This poem represents Jackson's break with the comic book world as he presents a harsh lesson about the reality of life between the panels, where our sidekicks and our friends don't come back. So Machine starts this discussion of the difference between real world and comic book reality. Let's take a closer look at the poem. Before this, please take a moment to pause the video and read the poem Machine in the Poems 3 folder. Welcome back. So if we look at these stanzas presented here, we start to see a sense of what is going on in the poem. It says, Stuart shows me the cross-like scars on his wrists, proud of his curiosity. He wanted to see how the veins pulled it all together, hoping to make sense of God's machine. Desperate to impart some final words of empathy that will convince him to stay with me, I feel like a part of him is in this place. So let's analyze these sections from the poem. First, as a reminder, if you see this slash, that represents that there has been a line break in the poem. All right, so let's take a look. So, as we know from analyzing and reading this poem, Machine represents a time in which Stuart has attempted suicide. He is in a sort of hospital, mental facility, right? And he is being visited by the Jackson narrator, right? Jackson has come there to see how his friend is doing. And in this, we have a conversation between the two friends. Stuart is showing the cross-like scars on his wrists, the place where he attempted to commit suicide, to the Jackson narrator. And the Jackson narrator is trying to convince and help his friend to stay with him, to not commit suicide. So let's start with lines 1 through 5 from the poem. Lines 1 through 5 show us that Stuart is lost and in search of understanding. Right? That Stuart's confusion with the world has caused him to commit suicide. And I mean confusion here broadly. Stuart obviously is suffering from some form of depression or mental illness, and his thing of saying he wanted to see the veins to hope to make sense of God's machine is sort of a hard attempt to understand why he feels this way and what is broken inside of him. Right? And that relates us to the title of the poem, Machine. The title of the poem relates to this idea of God's machine. Right? As we know, God's machine we could think of as Stuart himself or the human body, and machines break down. Right? Now, if we move towards the end of the poem, we get to the real crux of the conversation between the Jackson narrator and Stuart. We have the word empathy, that the Jackson narrator is desperate to impart some final words of empathy that will convince him, Stuart, to stay with me, the Jackson narrator. So lines 17 through 21 are being spoken by our narrator. This word empathy is important. Empathy is not sympathy. Oftentimes, many people will assume the word empathy means feeling bad for someone. That's not exactly true. The word empathy broadly means the recognition of someone else's existence, the recognition of their validity as a person that is not you. We could think of this, when people lack empathy, they are unable to see uh, other people's suffering, other people's conditions. They can only view the world through their own personal understanding of it. They don't believe that somebody else could have a different experience. Right? They are unable to recognize the existence of another person. So, when the Jackson narrator here is hoping to invite some parting words of empathy, what he is saying is he wants Stuart to recognize that Jackson, the Jackson narrator, is here to help him, that someone out here loves him, that the confusion that Stuart feels with the breakdown of God's machine is not the only thing, and that if he could see that the Jackson narrator cares for him, maybe he would not attempt to commit suicide again. So let's move to the final lines of the poem. The Jackson narrator continues, trying to impart these words of empathy, trying to make Stuart stay with him as a friend. I tell him it feels like a part of me is in this place. He smiles. A part of you is. Then laughs, as if he realizes the world has finally broken us in two. So one of the things to note as we look at this final lines, right? Stuart confirms that the relationship he has with the Jackson narrator is intense, that they are a friend, that a part of him will always be with Stuart. Right? It also emphasizes that the Jackson narrator has a feeling of responsibility towards Stuart. This notion of responsibility, that a part of the Jackson narrator is with Stuart, becomes important as we read the poem's fade later on in the book. The final lines of the poem relate back to the title as the machine of the world has finally severed the comic connection between the two, just like Stuart has tried to cut his wrists. So this moment in the poem, the Jackson narrator and Stuart have finally been separated. They can no longer be as intense friends as they were. And if we pay attention to the line breaks, the slashes here represent lines of poems that would start on a different line. The poem ends with, has broken us, line break in two. So graphically, the poem, by presenting to you a line break, is showing that these two characters have been split in two. Look at that part of the poem and you will see what I'm talking about. So machine represents the moment when the Jackson narrator and Stuart have irrevocably separated, that Stuart's mental state has broken down, his machine is no longer functioning. Next, let us analyze the poem Emergency. Emergency is a good poem to analyze how graphically the way a poem looks is as important to what the poem says. If you read Emergency, this will become apparent in the way that Jackson, the author, has written the poem, the way he has made it look to you, the reader. Emergency is the only poem from Stuart's point of view. It represents the final moments of Stuart and his life. Quick note to remember, this is Gary Jackson, our author, imagining the last moments of Stuart's life from his friend's perspective. It is not Stuart per se, but Jackson thinking through Stuart's last moment. The end of this poem should be studied along with the poem Fade. So as we start to look at Emergency, please stop the video now and take time to read the poem. Welcome back. So let's take a look at lines 14 through 23. Gary sees something in the way I look at those scars, studying them. The roadmap buried under flesh. Later, we pretend nothing's wrong, but I'm living in nostalgia. The moment I'm in is already gone. This is the moment in the play where the poem starts to break down graphically. The spacing and line arrangements representing Stuart's own mental breakdown. So if you examine the poem before you reach lines 14 to 23, it looks like the rest of the poems from the book you have written. Ordered stanzas, everything kind of consistent to all of the poems you have come before. But at this point, we start to see that the space lines and breaks between the poems become longer and more erratic. This is meant to represent graphically Stuart's own thinking becoming erratic and unpredictable. In addition, this moment echoes the moments in earlier poems as the breakdown between the dynamic duo of the Jackson narrator and Stuart. Gary here is the Gary that is referred to in all the other Stuart poems, and this Gary here is the narrator. He is the Jackson narrator. Finally, this last line is important. Living in nostalgia. Now, nostalgia is a type of memory, all right? And nostalgia is always something that you have positive feelings for, right? You can't have nostalgia for something that is bad or something that was traumatic in your life. You have nostalgia for things that were happy. You have fond memories of things that have happened to you in the past. A happy moment from your childhood, a happy moment with your best friend, for instance. These are all memories that we have that make us feel good. That is nostalgia. Stuart here, as our narrator, is saying that the present of the poem, the time he is talking with Gary right now that is presented here, is like to him a memory that has already passed. Right? He's no longer living in the present. This present interaction is in fact a moment that has passed. His real life has already gone. So it is at this moment where we could say that Stuart's decision to commit suicide in the poem, there is no going back. This is the moment from which Stuart will commit suicide, because his life that he's living in the present time of the poem, he feels is just nostalgia. There's no good times coming ahead. There's no good feeling right now. It's all memories that have faded. Let's move on to lines 30 through 35. Here, Stuart, our narrator, describes these as, I imagine, riding those veins home, tracing their origin back to the heart, a violent muscle that threshes 70 beats per minute, even at rest. This is a description of how Stuart feels about his own body. He's embodying his feelings to you, the reader. This should also connect you back to the ideas of machine, that the pressure of the world is damaging Stuart's mentality. He's describing to you, why he feels his God's machine, his body, is broken down. Now, let's take a look and talk about the heart. So, Stuart has given us a moment of feeling, going through his body, all of his feelings, tracing back to their origin, his heart. Right. Now, look at how the heart is described here. It is a violent muscle that threshes 70 beats per minute, even at rest. Right. The heart is the symbol of Stuart's emotions. Now, the heart here is described as something that is violent. All right, a violent muscle. Right. Threshes. Take a moment and look that word up. Right. You see that threshes is a cutting idea, so that even at rest, even when Stuart appears calm, his emotions, his inner turmoil, the symbol of his spirit, his heart, is violently cutting him at every moment. This is a description of how Stuart's God machine has broken down and how much pain he feels. Traditionally, the heart as a symbol represents things that are positive: love, passion, our will, spirit, kindness. Notice how all of these emotions are absent when the heart is described as a violent muscle that threshes 70 beats. So Stuart's heart doesn't give him any of the traditional feelings of comfort, passion, or love. His heart is only giving him pain. And a heart is a thing that can be broken, which Stuart's most certainly is. All right, take a few moments and read the last lines of the poem. We see as we look at this graphically, the poem has completely broken down. Everything around me used up. One more use, one more night. Hurry before the sun shatters me to pieces. The breakdown of the poem here is graphically represented the complete breakdown of Stuart's mental states. Nothing can be ordered. The words come in patches and jagged spaces. The poem itself is falling to pieces, just as Stuart's mental state has been shattered to pieces. The breakdown of the poem shows an inevitability of Stuart's breakdown. There was no act that Gary in the poem could do to stop this collapse. Stuart's destiny is a tragic destiny. It is not a comic destiny between two friends. There is no coming back to life for Stuart as there is for Robin or Bucky. The ending of the poem also represents how Stuart commits suicide. If you notice in the poem earlier, Stuart talks about purchasing a gun, and he uses this gun to shoot himself. We can assume shooting himself in the head, literally shattering himself to pieces. So the poem, the end of Emergency, as a poem, its complete falling apart as a graphic form, represents Stuart's own complete mental breakdown. Our next and final video will cover the poem Fade, and will bring to an end our discussion of the Stuart Cycle.